Today we're gonna do a drawing by this guy, Franz de Mieris, from the 1600s. He was a Dutch portrait painter. As you can see, he was a capable painter. He made a living selling paintings, but the drawing we're gonna copy isn't that great. So de Mieris calls this his portrait of a boy. And it doesn't really look like a boy, does it? It looks like a funny looking little man with a double chin. Um, Sometimes it's a little easier to copy things that are not masterpieces because our drawings don't always look perfect, and we can also learn a lot from these sort of minor masters because the work's a little less imposing. We can sort of see the way he's thinking through some of the problems of drawing that we're struggling with, and it's not a bad idea to try. So we're going to start out by laying out another circle for the Loomis head, and we're going to think about his side plane of the face and the hairline, the brow line, bottom of the nose, the jaw, throat, and then as always we're going to proceed by sort of just blocking in the collar and shoulders. I think I might want to zoom out just a little. He's got a very elegant outfit. Now you may be wondering, aren't the proportions of children supposed to be a little different? And they are. And I think de Mieris may have missed something there, and he may have given his little boy, who does look like a little boy in the face slightly, a little bit too much of adult proportions, and that's might be why he looks a little weird. So everyone finding their way around. Here's the side plane of the face, bottom of the nose. The brow line is going right through the center of this. The hairline's way up here. And that produces eyes, which in this little boy are in the middle of the head. In a lot of little boys, I think you more typically find the eyes slightly lower down. Okay. What do you think we're going to do next? We are going to shadow map. So guess I'll go ahead and do what I normally do and just sort of rough it in for you so you can see what I'm seeing. Shadow shape. Like that. There's one here. One there. One there. There's one sort of covering the upper lip. And one under the bottom lip. Maybe some very small shadow shapes over here. So, the roundness of his cheek is making the side plane sort of hard to read. But notice this shadow cuts way back into that side plane. Comes around. I'm drawing this darker than I want you to draw it so you can see what I'm doing. You can draw these maps very faintly. Shadow shape. If I measure, I can see that the eye that's near to us is just about centered on the head. So if you measure from here to here, this is that eye, it's about the same as here to here. So make sure you're doing that. I'm not going to draw the eye, I'm just sort of going to block in where it's going to be, and that's going to help me with these little shadow shapes that are around it. This one and this one. Obviously, if you're drawing yourself in the mirror or a model, you don't get to shadow map what you're seeing in green. I'm just trying to use that annotation so you can see on your screen sort of what I'm looking for when I shadow map and somewhat simplify the process. But one of the most important things is to get over the idea that these are commitments to anything. We're not committing to this shadow map. We are sort of taking a first stab at it. And there's no point in fine-tuning it until it's shaded. Mieris really downplays the hatching. It's difficult to tell which way his hand's moving, so what I'm going to do is copy that sort of dense tonal effect that he's producing using the side of my pencil. And there it is, something of a volume. Not yet a convincing volume, but we can start to see three-dimensional form. Now because the edges that he's creating are so soft, I'm going to go around and erase the very mapping that I just created, because I just needed that to show where those tones go. If you did your map lightly, as I advised, you won't have to do so much erasing. Just want to soften those edges. Okay. What I neglected to do was to map out the hair shadow. So I'm going to add that now. I didn't really block in the hair either. It's got this big tangle of curls. And just a little bit of halftone on that side of the forehead. Please keep everything vague like I'm doing. That's really the thing we're working on here, is just working tonally until we start to see a resemblance. Now the two darks that I haven't put in yet are the darks of the irises, and watch how I do that. Just hatch in a little patch of dark and do the same thing over here. And notice that already we can see direction of the gaze, and we can even correct it. I can just sort of scoot this dark slightly to the right until it feels like the gaze here is similar to the gaze over there. I'm satisfied with the structure of this. I'm just going to pop in this little cast shadow on the back of his collar. And we're going to try to zoom in now and take a look at the features. What a face. Okay, let's start with this eye. As you study this drawing close up, I hope you can resist the temptation to turn it into a bunch of really hard outlines, because that's not what we're seeing. We're seeing these sort of soft tonal transitions. Having to find this eyelid, I need to correct my gaze again. That iris is too far to the left. The eye is also too small to be, in relation to the head, to be a convincing portrait of a young boy. And watch how this line comes around and just fades away. And that's where the white of the eye ends. And the lash line is not even drawn in. But the boy has no lower lashes, but there's some very subtle modeling under here, very, very light, but just enough to give an impression of this plane change between the eye socket and the upper surface of the lower eyelid. Sort of like that. Look at that eyebrow. It's just a little dark smudge. And that outside corner of the eye really drops down, again giving him a sort of elderly look. It's kind of a sad little boy. And this sort of little shading here creates that structure of a sort of a pouch of the eye socket, which again ages him in a way that I think we find a little awkward. I want to do something with the contour of the cheek while I'm over here. So notice that this cuts in towards the eye socket from the brow ridge. And then, again, I'm going too dark. You probably are too. Look at how light he's kept this contour. Because again, this is a light surface with a light background. So why would we draw a dark line? This boy's almost has jowls. That's really the strangest thing about him. But as much as I mock this drawing, there's a lightness of touch here that I'm having a very difficult time reproducing. It's really impressive on a certain level. So here's the little tiny shadow shape defining the inside of that cheek. And here's this very flat little nose. It seems that for the pose, Mieris has twisted the nose just slightly towards us, which makes it look a little bit flat. And the mouth, also, we'll talk about that in a minute, but it's also not quite consistent with this pose. But we're going to just draw what we see here. So having defined this shadow edge up here, I have a really good idea of what this nostril's doing. Notice Mieris' shading direction along this crease is he's shading with the crease, which is always something I try to avoid when drawing young people, because that makes the crease look deeper than we want it to look. There's that nostril inside the ala. And he did a good job of foreshortening this nostril. Notice how much smaller it is than the one that's turned towards us. And then a little bit of halftone along here to define the tip of the nose. And a little bit of halftone up here, which defines the beginning of the bridge of the nose. Very subtle though. And I'm going to just bury this in shadow a little deeper. And now move on to the mouth. Remember to pause the video if you're having a hard time keeping up. So, this side of the mouth here should be much shorter than this side in a 3/4 view, but in spite of the elegance of his execution, Mieris has not really done that. He's done a very symmetrical little Cupid's bow. We're just going to copy what he did though. So we have the central portion of the Cupid's bow, which is basically centered under the tip of the nose and the philtrum. And again, he's exaggerated these twists of the Cupid's bow because that's more commonly seen in young people. So if he looks babyish or boyish at all, it's partly due to this very undulating form of the mouth. And notice this line is so definite where the lips meet, and this edge up here, the margin of the upper lip, very subtle, not outlined at all. And this little shadow shape here we barely have to touch, but notice that these halftones kind of wrap around the upper part of the chin. And over here we've got the other eye. I'm just going to check my work here. If I go from this curve straight up a little bit, we sort of go into this halftone around the eye socket. And look at the shape of that eyelid. And look at how wonderfully he gets that little sense of the highlight on the iris. It's not overdone, it's not too distinct or too bright, but it's just that little lightening on the side of the iris that lets you know that the eye is slightly wet and reflective. See how I just carved away a little light on the surface of my eyelid? Don't think of that as fixing a mistake. that's like, remember, think of the first step as just sort of roughing everything in as if it was clay. And by pushing those shadows around, we are just sort of refining the form. The eraser is just as valuable a tool as the pencil. And I hate those teachers who say, no erasing. There's another one. This shadow just ended up too low. And notice we're trying to copy Mieris's actual line direction now, because we can see it not in his first shading, but in his final shading. We can also see that he's using much nicer paper than we're using. You see the texture of that paper? These kind of light graphite techniques are really more effective on a beautiful handmade paper like Mieris is using, and not so much on this cheap stuff. While we're zoomed in, I'm going to clean things up a little. Put in this really too sharp halftone on this jowly form on the side of the mouth. And on this one. And then we're going to do the chin, or chins. Notice here's the plane change. This is where the form of the chin overlaps the form of the neck. And look at the clarity of the reflected light underneath. So he actually made it maybe even a little too bright. He definitely exaggerated, but it does give a wonderful kind of roundness to the form of the chin. And then we gotta go a step darker under that reflected light before rapidly switching to another reflected light on the neck. And I'm going to check this contour coming up. Notice this contour here is darker than it was on the cheek because this is a dark form. Okay, just going to connect. See how this shadow shape and this one are connected by a little bit of halftone. Very light touch through there. And then see how this core shadow is really dark. And that gives a sense of a little bit of reflected light above this nostril here. Okay, time to, well, one more thing while we're zoomed in. I'm just going to darken the top of this iris a little bit. Maybe the other one too. Remember, the eyelid casts a shadow onto the iris. And if you don't make them dark enough, they're going to look like they're popping out of the head. Okay. Okay, time to zoom out. What a kid. Okay, now we've got a very dense shadow along here. Notice I'm starting to copy Mieris' shading direction. This is totally by the book, right? This is how I teach you to draw spheres. Just curving these lines up and around. And they're curving and wrapping around the cheek. Studying the work of these minor masters is really good, because when you study the great masters, it's a little harder to see the techniques that they've learned, because they're so good at making it sort of covering their tracks. Everything looks so perfect, you just can't imagine it being any other way. When you see a minor master drawing like this, you can have a rare insight into the techniques of drawing that he was taught, which would have been the same techniques that were taught to his more gifted contemporaries, if that makes any sense. So I'm pretty happy with where the back of my neck is here, so I'm going to darken that. Often I remeasure that, but we already measured this eye position, so I feel like it's okay. I just brightened the exposure a little bit, because I thought my paper was looking kind of gray. The cheekbone on this child is massive. As I said, we think of the side plane of the head here, but this cheekbone just sort of pops right out of it. And notice the very subtle lightening through here, which is another reflected light. Now, when we get to the details in the collar, we're going to try to emulate the the sort of bravado with which he sketches this in. Heavy lines, quick. The artist David Hockney made an argument that this sort of technique, when you see it in these master drawings, really looks like the sort of line quality that one would make if one was tracing something. I agree with him. It looks like there's no searching. It's like the lines are just knocked in, and it may be that that's indicative of the fact that drawings like this may have been created with the help of various mirrors or camera lucida or other kind of optical devices. But we're not going to spend too long on that. And when it comes to the hair, I want you to notice that what we're seeing is really more like Raphael than it's different. There were techniques for doing things like this. Nobody figured it out by looking at people. They figured it out by looking at other art, which is, of course, what we're doing today. And that is significant. There was a language of line that was used to depict things like hair and foliage of trees and grass, and it was learned. I gotta clean this up before I put my details in. And it was learned by extensive copying work. I'll tell you one reason why this kind of work may not feel fun for you. And it's probably, if you're not having fun, it's because you're asking too much of yourself. You're demanding a level of perfection that you should not expect to have. I want you to trust me that if you just do a lot of copies like this, you're going to get so much better. And it's just like going out to the tennis court and hitting a bucket of balls into the net. If you expect to serve like a tennis pro, you're going to have a rotten time. But if you're honest with yourself about where you are and understand that you are just going to keep getting better and better with every ball you hit, it's kind of fun. It's fun to watch yourself improve as long as you can remain realistic about where you are. And the reason most artists, I think, get that crushed feeling when they draw something bad is because we don't think of drawing as something that one just practices and gets better at. We think of drawing as a gift, and people talk about it that way all the time. Like, you really have a knack for that. You're really talented. Um, they don't say, boy, you've been working really hard at this. They say, you're a genius. You've really got it. And there may be something to natural ability, but there's a lot more to practice. And the people who we tend to identify as having this supposed natural ability are usually just people who spent more time practicing than other people. Often when they were young and had nothing better to do. And it's those kids who, for whatever reason, just used a big chunk of their young childhood in drawing just because they like to do it, not because their art teacher made them, who then get identified in middle school and high school as having a lot of so-called talent, and they're the ones who stick with it. But the fact of the matter is, if you start doing it every day, especially if you're still at least a teenager or in your early 20s, you're going to get better really fast and make up for lost time. But again, the irony is that people don't practice because they see their bad drawings and they think, oh, I don't have what it takes to do this, so it's not fun, so I don't do it, so I don't ever get good. And that's the sort of mindset that we need to combat if we want to get good at anything. So there he is. What a dashing fellow. And at least this time, if there's something a little weird about your drawing, then there's probably a few things that are weird about mine, and we can feel good about it anyway, because this drawing was weird right from the start. But not without some very impressive technique and some impressive little touches of the pencil. That's it for today, and I thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.